Hey there! The story of the Crimean War is often told through the clash of empires, the roar of cannons, and the generals who sent men to their deaths. But there was another battlefield, one hidden behind canvas walls and the stench of rot, where the fight wasn't against the enemy as bullets, but against infection, exhaustion, and despair. Here, women in starched aprons stepped into a world that seemed determined to break them. They crossed seas to serve in hospitals that were nothing more than filthy barracks, where rats picked at bandages and snow blew through broken windows. They were given no protection, no proper supplies, and often no respect. Yet they faced down horrors that hardened soldiers could barely endure, holding the hands of men as their lives slipped away, carrying water too foul to drink, and mopping floors already slick with blood. These nurses were abandoned by the very armies they served, overrun by waves of wounded, and often bleeding themselves from the strain. Their courage wasn't forged on the battlefield, but in the quiet, relentless work of keeping others alive when no one came to keep them safe. This is their story. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for war, but they went anyway. In the autumn of 1854, dozens of women, many young, many middle class, many with no experience beyond the drawing rooms of Victorian England boarded ships bound for the Crimean Peninsula. They left behind comfort, safety, and familiarity. What lay ahead was chaos, cold, blood, and a kind of suffering they had never imagined. They were nurses, or at least they would become nurses. Some were nuns, some were volunteers. Some were simply women who had answered a call. Florence Nightingale, the woman who had become the face of wartime nursing, led the charge. But she wasn't alone. Behind her were women who would never be remembered, who would never be honored, but who endured just as much. The journey itself was brutal. The ships were overcrowded, damp, and slow. Supplies were limited. Privacy was non-existent. The women slept in cramped quarters, often beside crates of medical equipment, food, and ammunition. Seasickness was constant. The air was thick with salt, sweat, and fear. And every mile brought them closer to a front line that was already collapsing under the weight of disease and death. They didn't know what awaited them. They had heard rumors of wounded men lying in filth, of hospitals overrun, of surgeons operating with rusty tools. But nothing could prepare them for the reality. The Crimean War was a disaster. British troops were dying not just from bullets, but from cholera, dysentery, and frostbite. The medical infrastructure was non-existent. The hospitals were makeshift barracks, filled with rats, sewage, and screens. Supplies were mismanaged. Leadership was chaotic. And into this nightmare walked women who had never seen a battlefield. They arrived in Scutari, a town across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, where the British had set up their main hospital. It was supposed to be a place of healing. It was a place of horror. The wounded lay on bare floors. Blood pooled in corners. The stench of infection hung in the air. And the nurses, many still in their traveling clothes, were expected to begin work immediately. They rolled up their sleeves. They boiled water. They scrubbed floors. They dressed wounds. They held dying men's hands. And they did it all while being doubted, dismissed, and disrespected. Many of the male doctors resented them. They saw the nurses as intruders, as distractions, as women who didn't belong. Florence Nightingale fought for authority, for resources, for respect. But even she was undermined. Supplies she requested were delayed. Orders she gave were ignored. And still, she and her nurses kept working. They worked through the night. They worked without rest. They worked while sick, while grieving, while exhausted. And they saw things no one should see. Men with limbs blown off. Men screaming for mothers. Men dying slowly, painfully, alone. They wrote letters home that were soaked in tears. They kept journals filled with prayers, with rage, with sorrow. They buried the dead. They comforted the living. They became the only light in a place that had forgotten how to hope. And they were changed. The women who boarded those ships were not the same women who returned. If they returned, some died in the Crimea. From disease, from exhaustion, from heartbreak. Others came home with scars visible and invisible. They had seen the worst of humanity, and they had responded with the best. Their journey was not just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, transformational. They had walked into hell, and they had brought healing. They weren't trained, they weren't prepared, but they were brave, and that bravery reshaped history. Before the nurses even saw the wounded, they smelled them. The stench hit first. It clung to the air like fog, thick, sour, and unforgettable. It was the smell of blood, of rot, of human decay. It was the smell of gangrene, of unwashed bodies, of death. And it poured out of the hospitals like smoke from a burning building. These weren't hospitals in the modern sense. They were converted barracks, abandoned stables, crumbling monasteries. They were places not built for healing, but for holding. Holding the broken, the dying, the forgotten. Inside, the floors were slick with blood. The walls were stained with filth. The beds, if there were beds, were often shared by 2 or 3 men. Some lay on straw. Some lay on bare wood. Some lay directly on the stone floor. And all of them suffered. The wounded arrived in waves. After every battle, carts rolled in filled with men barely alive. Some had been shot. Some had been burned. Some had been trampled. Many had been left untreated for days. Their wounds were infected. Their clothes were soaked in blood and feces. Their eyes were glazed with pain. There were no antiseptics. No proper sanitation. Surgeons operated with bare hands, using knives that had never been cleaned. Instruments were reused without thought. Bandages were scarce. Water was contaminated. And the nurses, many of whom had never seen a wound before, were thrown into this chaos with no training, no guidance, and no protection. They learned fast. They learned to recognize gangrene by its smell. They learned to cut away rotting flesh. They learned to boil water, to sterilize tools, to improvise bandages from torn sheets. They learned to comfort men who screamed through amputations. They learned to hold hands as the light faded from a soldier's eyes. And they learned to endure. The hospitals were overcrowded beyond imagination. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, groaning, coughing, dying. Rats ran freely, feeding on scraps and sometimes on flesh. Sewage seeped through the walls. The air was thick with disease, cholera, typhus, dysentery. The nurses were not immune. Many fell ill. Some died, but they kept working. They worked in shifts that never ended. They carried buckets of waste. They scrubbed floors. They changed dressings. They whispered prayers. They wrote letters for the dying. They became the only source of comfort in a place that had forgotten mercy. Florence Nightingale walked the halls with a lamp, checking on patients long after midnight. Her presence became a symbol of hope, but she was not alone. Behind her were dozens of women anonymous, uncelebrated, who gave everything they had. They faced hostility. From doctors, from officers, from the system itself. Supplies were withheld. Orders were ignored. Their authority was questioned. But they persisted. They organized. They cleaned. They healed. And slowly, the hospitals began to change. Clean water was brought in. Ventilation was improved. Bedding was replaced. Sanitation protocols were introduced. Mortality rates dropped. The smell of death began to fade. Not completely. Never completely. But enough to breathe. The nurses transformed the hospitals not just physically, but spiritually. They brought compassion, dignity, humanity. They treated every man as someone worth saving, worth comforting, worth remembering. And they paid a price. Many returned home broken. haunted by what they had seen, by the screams, the smells, the endless rows of dying men. Some never spoke of it again, some never recovered. But their work reshaped medicine, reshaped war, reshaped history. They had walked into places that reeked of death, and they had brought life. They didn't stop when the sun went down. In the Crimean War, night didn't bring rest. It brought silence, shadows, and suffering. The wounded didn't wait for daylight. They arrived in waves, long after the last cannon had fired, carried on stretchers made from broken doors, bundled in blood-soaked coats, or dragged in by fellow soldiers, too weak to speak. And the nurses, exhausted, undertrained, and overwhelmed, kept working. They worked in darkness. The hospitals were barely buildings. Converted barracks, crumbling stables, and damp stone halls. Windows were shattered. Roofs leaked. The floors were cold and slick with blood. There was no electricity, no sterile operating rooms. Just flickering candles, sputtering oil lamps, and the occasional glow of Florence Nightingale's lantern. But even her light couldn't reach every corner. Candles were precious. Oil was rationed. The nurses often worked with nothing but a stub of wax, its flame dancing in the drafty corridors. When the wind blew through broken windows, the light vanished, and they were left blind. They learned to bandage by feel, to find wounds by touch, to listen for the sound of pain. A man's ragged breathing became a guide. A whispered plea for water led them to a shattered leg. The groan of a soldier with a chest wound became a beacon in the black. They moved between rows of bodies, stepping over rats, kneeling in blood, reaching for limbs they couldn't see. They worked with trembling hands, with eyes strained from smoke and fatigue, with hearts breaking and still beating. Rats were everywhere. They scurried across the floors, nested in piles of discarded linen, and gnawed at the edges of food rations. Some grew bold, darting between the beds, drawn by the scent of blood. Nurses slapped them away mid-procedure, cursed them under their breath, and sometimes wept when they found one curled beside a corpse. Lice infested the bedding. Flies swarmed the wounds. Confection spread like wildfire. And still the nurses worked. They boiled water when they could. They tore sheets into bandages. They used vinegar to clean wounds. They improvised with what they had, and what they had was almost nothing. There were no antiseptics, no proper surgical tools, no gloves. Nurses used their bare hands. They wrapped wounds with strips of cloth, sometimes still damp from the last patient. They held men down during amputations. They whispered prayers while blood soaked through their aprons. They learned to recognize gangrene by its smell, to cut away rotting flesh, to comfort men who screamed through procedures, to hold hands as the light faded from a soldier's eyes. They wrote letters for the dying. They sang hymns in the dark. They became the only source of comfort in a place that had forgotten mercy. Florence Nightingale walked the halls with her lamp, checking on patients long after midnight. Her presence became a symbol of hope, but she was not alone. Behind her were dozens of women anonymous, uncelebrated, who gave everything they had. They faced hostility from doctors, from officers, from the system itself. Supplies were withheld. Orders were ignored. Their authority was questioned. But they persisted. They organized. They cleaned. They healed. And slowly the hospitals began to change. Clean water was brought in. Ventilation was improved. Bedding was replaced. Sanitation protocols were introduced. Mortality rates dropped. The smell of death began to fade. Not completely, never completely, but enough to breathe. The nurses didn't sleep, not really. They collapsed for minutes at a time, curled in corners, wrapped in blankets that smelled of bleach and blood. They woke to screams, to coughing, to the sound of another stretcher arriving. They grew thin, pale, hollow-eyed. Some fell ill. Some died, but they kept going because the calling didn't care about comfort. It cared about compassion. And the nurses believed that every man deserved dignity, even in the dark. They didn't want help, not from women, not from nurses, not from anyone who hadn't been trained in the hallowed halls of medicine. In the mid-19th century, the battlefield hospitals of the Crimean War were ruled by male surgeons' men who believed they alone held the keys to healing. They wore blood-stained coats like armor, barked orders like generals, and treated the wounded with a brutal efficiency that left little room for compassion. And when the nurses arrived, they saw not all eyes, but intruders. The nurses came with bandages, with vinegar, with soap and water. They came with quiet voices and steady hands. They came with the belief that healing was more than cutting and stitching. It was caring. But the surgeons didn't see that. They saw interference. They saw challenge. They saw women stepping into a world that had always belonged to men. Some doctors refused to speak to the nurses. Others mocked them openly. They dismissed their observations, ignored their warnings, and rejected their suggestions. When a nurse pointed out signs of infection, she was told to stay in her place. When she asked for clean linens, she was laughed at. When she tried to organize the chaos, she was accused of meddling. The tension was thick. The nurses were often relegated to the dirtiest tasks, scrubbing floors, hauling water, disposing of amputated limbs. They were kept away from surgical procedures, denied access to medical supplies, and excluded from decision-making. Their presence was tolerated, but never welcomed. Florence Nightingale, despite her reputation, faced the same resistance. She was a woman in a man's world, and her authority was constantly undermined. She wrote reports, gathered data, proposed reforms, and was met with silence. Her calls for sanitation were ignored. Her requests for supplies were delayed. Her efforts to reduce mortality were dismissed as sentimental nonsense. But the nurses didn't leave. They didn't retreat. They stayed. They worked. They endured. And slowly, the cracks began to show. The surgeons were drowning. The wounded kept coming. The infections kept spreading. The death toll kept rising. And the nurses, those quiet, persistent women, kept saving lives. They cleaned wounds that surgeons had forgotten. They comforted men the doctors had written off. They prevented deaths that medicine had failed to stop. The doctors began to notice. They saw patients recovering under the nurses' care. They saw wards that smelled less of rot and more of soap. They saw statistics that couldn't be ignored. And desperation forced them to listen. They began to ask questions, to seek advice, to collaborate. Not all of them. Not immediately, but enough. The nurses didn't gloat. They didn't demand recognition. They simply kept working. They taught the surgeons how to prevent infection. They showed them how to organize supplies. They demonstrated the power of hygiene, of compassion, of consistency. And the hospitals began to change. The surgeons began to change. Some even apologized. The war didn't end because of the nurses, but the suffering did lessen. The death toll did drop. The wounded did heal. And the legacy of those women, once seen as obstacles, became the foundation of modern nursing. They were no longer intruders. They were indispensable. The screams never stopped. They echoed through the stone corridors, bounced off the blood-stained walls, and seeped into the bones of every nurse who heard them. They came in waves, raw, guttural, desperate. The sound of men begging for mercy, pleading for death, crying out for mothers who would never come. It was the soundtrack of the war's cruelest ritual, the amputation. There was no anesthetic, not in the field hospitals, not for the poor, not for the unlucky. Chloroform was rare, ether even rarer. And when the wounded arrived with shattered limbs, blackened flesh, or bones exposed to the air, there was no time to wait. The surgeons had one solution: cut it off. They worked fast. Speed was survival. A good surgeon could remove a leg in under 3 minutes. A skilled one could do it in 2. But no matter how quick the blade, the pain was eternal. The men screamed until their voices broke. They thrashed until they were pinned. They sobbed until they passed out or didn't. And the nurses held them down. They weren't trained for this. They hadn't come to the war to become restraints. But when the order came, hold him, they obeyed. They knelt beside the operating tables, gripped arms slick with sweat and blood, pressed down on chests that heaved with terror. They whispered comfort that couldn't be heard over the screams. Some men begged to be shot instead. Some cursed God. Some bit through their own tongues. And the nurses stayed. They didn't flinch. They didn't run. They bore witness to every cut, every crack of bone, every final gasp. The tools were primitive. Bone saws, knives, forceps, tourniquets twisted tight with sticks. There was no sterilization, no clean surfaces. The same instruments were used again and again, wiped on aprons, dunked in tepid water, passed from one surgeon to the next. Infection was inevitable. Death was common. The nurses cleaned what they could. They boiled water when it was available. They scrubbed tables between procedures. They tried to create order in a place ruled by chaos. But the amputations kept coming. Sometimes the men survived. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they woke up days later, staring at the empty space where a leg used to be, and screamed all over again. The nurses were there for that too. They changed dressings. They drained pus. They held hands. They wrote letters to families, describing recoveries that weren't real, offering hope that wouldn't last. They became the bridge between agony and silence. They saw the toll it took on the surgeons. The way their hands shook after the 10th procedure. The way they drank to forget. The way they stopped looking patients in the eye. And they saw the toll it took on themselves. Some nurses broke. They wept in corners. They vomited after shifts. They dreamed of saws and screams and blood. But they returned. Every day. Every night. Because the men needed them. Because no one else would stay. The amputations were endless. The cries were endless. The war was endless. But so was the courage. And in the darkest hours, when the blade met bone and the screens rose again, the nurses stood firm. They were the last comfort, the last kindness, the last human touch before the pain took everything. The nurses began to understand that filth wasn't just a nuisance, it was a killer. It crept in silently, disguised as routine, embedded in the very structure of the hospitals. The buildings themselves were part of the problem. Cracked stone walls harbored mold. Wooden beams soaked up blood and sewage. There were no proper drains, no sealed floors, no barriers between the sick and the septic. They tried to isolate the worst cases. They moved the gangrenous to one side of the ward, the dysentery patients to another. But space was limited. Beds were crammed together, sometimes 3 men to a cot. The air was thick with the smell of rot and excrement. Curtains were rare. Privacy was non-existent. And the filth didn't respect boundaries. It clung to everything. To the instruments, reused without sterilization. To the aprons, stained beyond recognition. To the hands of the nurses, who washed them in basins that hadn't been emptied in hours. They knew the risks. They saw the consequences. But they had no choice. They began to innovate. Florence Nightingale pushed for the creation of clean zones, areas where fresh water was stored, where linens were kept off the ground, where patients could be treated without immediately being recontaminated. She fought for ventilation, for sunlight, for the simple act of opening windows. And she documented everything, every death, every infection, every failure. Her data became a weapon. She used statistics to shame the military, to expose the negligence, to demand reform. And slowly, grudgingly, the system began to respond. New protocols were introduced. Sanitation became a priority, but implementation was slow and resistance was fierce. Many officers believed filth was inevitable. That war was dirty, and nothing could change that. They mocked the nurses' efforts, dismissed their concerns, refused to allocate resources. But the nurses persisted. They cleaned with rags when mops weren't available. They hauled buckets of water up flights of stairs. They burned contaminated bedding in open pits. They became warriors in their own right. Not with rifles, but with soap. Not with bullets, but with boiling water. They fought for every inch of cleanliness, every moment of relief, and they paid the price. Their hands cracked and bled. Their lungs burned from the fumes. Their backs ached from endless scrubbing. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Some succumbed to the very infections they tried to prevent. But they kept going, because every clean bed meant one less death. Every disinfected wound meant one more chance. Every rat driven out, every lice-infested blanket burned, every latrine emptied was a victory. They learned to read the signs, the color of pus, the smell of decay, the fever that signaled sepsis. They became experts in infection control long before the term existed. They developed instincts sharper than any textbook, and they shared their knowledge, teaching each other, training new arrivals, building a network of resistance against the filth. They didn't win every battle. Some wards remained cesspools. Some patients died in squalor, but they changed the narrative. They proved that cleanliness was not a luxury, it was a necessity. That dignity could exist even in war. That healing required more than medicine, it required sanitation. And they did it all while surrounded by mud, lice, and sewage. Because filth was the enemy, and they were the front line. They tried to write it down. The nurses, surrounded by blood and screams and silence, reached for pen and paper in the few moments they had to themselves. They wrote by candlelight, with trembling hands, on scraps of parchment stained with sweat. They wrote to mothers, to sisters, to husbands, to friends. They wrote to remember, to release, to survive. But the truth was not welcome. They described the amputations, the screams, the rats, the filth. They wrote about the men who died with no one to hold their hand, about the surgeons who refused to listen, about the lice that crawled across their skin. They wrote about the smell of gangrene, the sound of bone being sawed, the way the light faded from a soldier's eyes. They wrote about the despair, and the military burned it. Censorship was brutal. Letters were intercepted, read, redacted, destroyed. Anything that revealed the true state of the war, the chaos, the incompetence, the suffering, was deemed dangerous. The public was not to know. Families were not to grieve. The image of the war had to remain noble, heroic, clean. So the nurses learned to lie. They wrote about bravery, about honor, about the resilience of the wounded. They described sunsets over the camp, the camaraderie among the staff, the small victories that kept them going. They buried the horror beneath layers of politeness. They turned screams into silence. But some couldn't do it. Some wrote the truth anyway. They hid letters in supply crates, gave them to trusted couriers, sent them through unofficial channels. Some made it home. Some were published. Some changed everything. Florence Nightingale's reports were among the few that pierced the veil. She used statistics, not emotion, charts, not cries. But behind every number was a story, a man who died in filth, a nurse who tried to save him, a system that failed them both. Her work forced reform, but it didn't erase the silence. The nurses carried the unsent letters in their minds. They remembered every word they couldn't write, every image they couldn't share, every truth they had to swallow. They became living archives of suffering, and they bore that weight alone. Some tried to keep journals, private records, diaries hidden beneath mattresses. But even those were at risk. Inspections were frequent, privacy was rare, and the fear of punishment was real. So they memorized. They told each other stories in whispers. They passed memories like contraband. They created oral histories that would never be recorded. They became each other's witnesses. And when the war ended, many never spoke of it again. They returned home changed, haunted, silent. Families asked questions. They gave vague answers, smiled, nodded, changed the subject, because the truth was too heavy, too raw, too real. Some tried to write again, years later, but the words had faded. The pain had buried them too deep, and the letters that could have told the world what really happened were gone, destroyed by fire, by fear, by silence. But not forgotten, because every nurse who held a dying man's hand, who scrubbed blood from the floor, who watched another life slip away, carried that story inside them. And even if the letters couldn't be sent, the truth remained, waiting. It should have been simple. A cup of water, a basic act of care, a gesture of mercy. But in the hospitals of the Crimean War, even water became a weapon. It shimmered in tin cups, looked harmless in buckets, trickled from barrels with the promise of relief. And yet, every drop carried danger. Dysentery lurked in the water, cholera, typhoid, invisible killers that turned kindness into catastrophe. The nurses knew it. They saw the consequences. A sip of water could mean days of agony, fever, vomiting, death. And still, the men begged for it. They were parched, their lips cracked, their tongues swelled, their throats burned. The wounded cried out for water more than morphine, more than food, more than prayer. And the nurses had to choose give comfort or risk infection. The supply lines were broken. Clean water was rare. Rainwater was collected in barrels, but the barrels were never cleaned. Wells were dug, but they were shallow, contaminated by nearby latrines. Rivers ran brown with waste. Buckets were shared between patients, between wards, between the living and the dead. The nurses tried to boil it, when they had fuel, when they had time. But the fires were needed for cooking, for sterilizing instruments, for warmth. Boiling water for drinking was a luxury they couldn't afford. So they filtered it through cloth, let it settle, prayed it was clean enough. It rarely was. Men who drank it began to shake, their stomachs twisted, their bowels emptied uncontrollably. The nurses cleaned them, comforted them, watched them waste away. They tried to isolate the infected, but space was limited. Dysentery spread like smoke. One cup, one sip, one mistake. They began to ration water, to deny it, to say no to the dying. It broke them. To see a man reach out with trembling hands, to hear him whisper please, and to turn away. But they had seen what happened when they said yes. Some tried to purify it with vinegar. Others added alcohol. Some mixed it with herbs, hoping to mask the taste of rot. But nothing worked consistently. The water remained a threat, a betrayal. Florence Nightingale fought for clean water. She demanded proper filtration, better storage, regular testing. She documented the deaths caused by contaminated water. She showed the link between sanitation and survival. Her reports were damning, her data irrefutable. But change was slow. The military resisted. Logistics failed. Supplies were delayed. And the nurses kept working with what they had. They carried water in leaking buckets, stored it in cracked basins, served it with apologies, and watched the consequences unfold. They learned to read the signs, the sudden fever, the sunken eyes, the smell. They knew when it was too late. They knew when the water had won. And they mourned every man who died not from bullets, but from a sip. They tried to protect each other, shared tips, warned newcomers, developed rituals around water, how to store it, how to serve it, how to pray over it. They became guardians of hydration, of survival, of hope. But the fear never left. Every time they dipped a ladle, filled a cup, touched a bucket, they wondered, is this the one? Is this the sip that kills? And they kept going, because the men needed water, because thirst was torture, because even poisoned comfort was better than none. They gave it with trembling hands, with whispered prayers, with eyes that had seen too much, and they watched. They watched the water take its toll. It came in waves. After every battle, the silence shattered. The wards, already crowded, already strained, were suddenly flooded. Hundreds of men arrived at once, bleeding, screaming, broken. The nurses barely had time to breathe before the next stretcher was dragged in. The floors were slick with blood, the air thick with cries, the chaos absolute. There were no protocols for this, no triage systems, no emergency plans, just instinct, just desperation, just women in aprons trying to hold back the tide of death. They moved fast. They cleared space. They laid men on the floor, on tables, on crates, anywhere, everywhere. The wounded kept coming. Some had limbs hanging by threads. Some had faces torn open. Some were silent, eyes wide, already halfway gone. The nurses didn't ask names. There wasn't time. They cut away uniforms. They searched for wounds. They tried to stop the bleeding. And they listened to the screams, to the gasps, to the silence that followed. They worked in pairs, in groups, alone. They shouted for supplies, for water, for surgeons. But the surgeons were overwhelmed too. The knives moved fast, the saws faster. Amputations became assembly lines. And the nurses held men down, wiped sweat from brows, whispered comfort that couldn't be heard over the agony. The smell was unbearable. Blood, pus, burned flesh, excrement. It clung to everything. The walls, the sheets, their skin. They stopped noticing. They stopped caring. They focused on the next wound, the next scream, the next life they might save. Some men died before they could be treated. Some died while being treated. Some died after. The nurses marked the bodies, covered them with sheets, moved them aside, and kept going. There was no time to mourn, no space to grieve. The living needed them. They ran out of bandages, tore up shirts, used towels. They ran out of water, used vinegar. They ran out of strength, kept going anyway. Their hands shook, their backs ached, their eyes burned, but they didn't stop. They learned to recognize the hopeless cases, the ones who wouldn't make it. They gave them morphine when they had it, held their hands when they didn't. They became midwives to death, guiding men through their final moments with as much dignity as war would allow. The noise was constant, screams, shouts, barked orders, the clatter of stretchers, the groan of pain, the silence of the dying. It became a rhythm, a terrible music, and the nurses moved to its beat. They didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't speak unless necessary. Their world narrowed to wounds and blood and breath. They forgot the date, the hour, the outside. They lived in the flood. And when it finally slowed, when the last stretcher was laid down, when the last scream faded, they collapsed, not in triumph, not in relief, but in exhaustion, in grief, in silence. Until the next wave came, because the war didn't stop. The battles didn't end. The dying didn't wait, and the nurses stood ready. Every time, they began to anticipate the floods. The distant thunder of cannon fire meant they had hours, maybe less. They prepared as best they could, stacked linens, boiled water, cleared space, but nothing was ever enough. The wounded always outnumbered the beds. The screams always outnumbered the hands. They created makeshift wards in hallways, in courtyards, in storage rooms. They laid men on straw, on stone, on dirt. They hung sheets for privacy that didn't exist. They worked in shifts that never ended. They passed each other like ghosts, nodding, whispering, collapsing. They saw things no one should see. A boy with half his face gone, still breathing. A man with both legs severed, asking if he could walk. A soldier clutching a locket, whispering a name until he died. They carried those, memories like wounds, invisible, permanent. They tried to keep records, names, injuries, outcomes. But the flood erased order. Paper soaked in blood. Ink smeared by tears. Files lost in the chaos. They relied on memory, on instinct, on the quiet knowledge that this man had been here before, and now he was gone. They became experts in suffering, in recognizing the difference between pain and panic, between a scream that meant, "Help me," and one that meant, "I'm already gone." They moved with precision, with empathy, with urgency. They became the pulse of the ward, and they were never enough. They watched men die waiting for a surgeon, for a bandage, for a sip of water. They held them as they slipped away, apologized, promised they had done all they could, and then turned to the next. They didn't cry. Not then, not there. The flood didn't allow it. But later, in corners, in silence, they wept. For the ones they couldn't save, for the ones they couldn't name, for the ones who died alone. They wrote letters they couldn't send, prayers they couldn't speak. They carried grief like a second skin. And still they returned, because the flood kept coming. And they were the dam. The cold became a second war. It didn't come with gunfire or bayonets, but it claimed lives all the same. It was quiet, creeping, merciless. It didn't discriminate. It took the wounded, the healthy, the nurses, the surgeons. It took the strong and made them weak. It took the weak and made them still. The nurses began to measure suffering in degrees. A man with a shattered leg might survive if he was warm. A man with a minor wound might die if he was cold. Hypothermia didn't care about rank or resilience. It came for everyone. They tried to create warmth from nothing. They stuffed straw into mattresses, hung blankets over doorways, lit candles in clusters. They used body heat as medicine. They pressed themselves against patients, held hands for hours, curled up beside the dying. They whispered stories, sang lullabies, recited prayers, not just for comfort, but to keep lips moving, to keep breath flowing, to keep life present. They rationed everything: blankets, coal, warm broth, even hope. They gave what they could, and when they had nothing left, they gave themselves. Their own warmth, their own strength, their own will. They watched each other fade. Nurses who had once stood tall, now hunched from the cold, their cheeks hollowed, their eyes dimmed, their hands trembled. They wrapped their feet in cloth, their heads in scarves, their hearts in silence. They didn't complain. They didn't cry. They endured. They saw the cold change the wounded. Men who had survived battle now lay dying from exposure. Their skin turned gray. Their breath slowed. Their eyes stared without seeing. The nurses tried everything: hot compresses, warm drinks, friction, prayer. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. They learned to recognize the signs: the stillness, the silence, the surrender. They marked the dying with chalk, moved them to the warmest corner, sat with them until the end, and then moved on. They didn't have time to grieve. The cold didn't allow it. The next patient needed them. The next wound needed cleaning. The next life needed saving. And so they kept going. They became legends in silence. No medals, no parades. Just women in frozen wards, fighting death with blankets and boiling water. They didn't ask for recognition. They asked for coal, for firewood, for warmth. Florence Nightingale fought for them. She wrote reports, compiled data, demanded change. She showed how cold killed as efficiently as bullets. She begged for supplies. Some came. Too late. Too little. The nurses didn't wait. They scavenged. They built stoves from scrap metal. They traded jewelry for firewood. They risked punishment to light fires in forbidden corners. They chose warmth over rules, life over protocol. They became engineers of survival. They taught each other how to trap heat, how to insulate walls, how to seal windows. They created systems where none existed. They didn't just fight the cold, they outsmarted it. But it was never enough. The cold kept coming, in waves, in silence, in death, and the nurses kept fighting, because the cold was constant. But so were they. They didn't train for this. No one told them they'd be lifting corpses. No one warned them that the men they comforted, bandaged, whispered to, would one day become weight in their arms. But the orderlies were too few, sometimes too afraid, sometimes too indifferent, and the dead couldn't stay. So the nurses carried them. They wrapped the bodies in sheets, when sheets were available. In coats, in blankets, in whatever they could find. They tied limbs together so they wouldn't drag. They covered faces, not just for dignity, but to protect themselves from the grief. And then they lifted. Some were light boys barely grown, hollowed by fever. Some were heavy men who had fought for days, who had clung to life with everything they had. Some were familiar faces they had washed, hands they had held, names they had whispered in the dark. They carried them through the wards, past the living, past the wounded. They tried to shield the others from the sight, but there was no hiding it. Death was everywhere, and the nurses became its messengers. They walked slowly, carefully. The floors were slick, the corridors narrow, the air heavy. They didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't falter. They placed the bodies in makeshift morgues rooms that had once held supplies, now filled with silence. They laid them side by side, covered them, marked them, and then they returned to the next patient, the next wound, the next life that might still be saved. They didn't have time to mourn. Grief was a luxury. The living needed them. So they buried it, deep, beneath layers of duty, beneath the blood and the bandages and the silence. But it surfaced, in dreams, in moments of stillness, in the way their hands trembled when they touched a man who reminded them of one they had lost, in the way they hesitated before lifting another body, in the way they whispered names they weren't supposed to remember. They tried to keep records, names, dates, causes. But the flood of death was too constant. Paper was scarce. Ink ran dry. Memory became the only archive, and it was full. They carried the dead not just in their arms, but in their minds. They remembered the ones who joked, who sang, who asked for letters to be sent. They remembered the ones who screamed, who begged, who went quietly. They remembered the ones who died alone. And they carried that too. Some nurses broke, collapsed, wept, were sent home. Others hardened, built walls, became efficient, detached. But most found a way to keep going, not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. The dead didn't wait. They carried them in pairs when they could, alone when they had to. They dragged bodies across courtyards, hauled them downstairs, lifted them onto carts. They became undertakers, gravekeepers, witnesses. They learned to move without emotion, to breathe through the stench, to ignore the flies, to focus on the task. But every body was a story, and stories don't stay silent. They whispered apologies, prayers, promises. They told the dead they were not forgotten, that they were loved, that they mattered. And then they let go until the next time, because the dying didn't stop, and neither did they. They were watched, not for their skill, not for their courage, but for their gender. The nurses who came to the war zone didn't just face blood and death. They faced suspicion, scrutiny, judgment. Every step they took, every word they spoke, every decision they made was weighed against a standard they were never meant to meet. They were accused of impropriety, of incompetence, of vanity, of distraction. Not because they failed, but because they dared to exist in a space reserved for men. They were told they didn't belong, that they were too emotional, too delicate, too disruptive, that their presence endangered discipline. They were watched when they walked through the wards, when they spoke to soldiers, when they gave comfort. A nurse who held a man's hand too long was whispered about. One who smiled was questioned. One who cried was condemned. Their compassion was mistaken for flirtation, their professionalism for arrogance. They were watched. Rumors spread that they were there for attention, for adventure, for scandal, that they were untrained, unfit, unworthy. Some officers refused to speak to them. Some doctors refused to work with them. Some patients were told not to trust them. They were blamed for things they couldn't control, for infections, for deaths, for delays. When supplies ran out, it was their fault. When a man died, it was their fault. When a ward descended into chaos, it was their fault. Not because they had failed, but because they were visible. They were punished for being seen. Some were dismissed, sent home, silenced. Others stayed, fought back, proved themselves again and again. They worked harder, longer, smarter. They documented everything, tracked outcomes, showed results. They built reputations not from praise, but from persistence. Florence Nightingale became their shield. Her data, her discipline, her defiance. She showed the world what nursing could be, what women could do. She faced the same accusations, the same slander, and she answered with facts, with reform, with revolution. But even she couldn't protect them all. Some nurses were destroyed by the rumors. Their careers ended, their names erased, their contributions forgotten. Others endured, quietly, without recognition, without reward. They became the foundation of a profession that didn't yet exist. They were pioneers, and they were punished for it. They learned to navigate the scrutiny, to speak carefully, to move deliberately, to dress modestly, to avoid eye contact, to suppress emotion. They became shadows in the wards, present but invisible, essential but unacknowledged. They built networks of support, whispered encouragement, shared strategies, protected each other. They became sisters in silence, warriors in white. They carried each other through the judgment, through the slander, through the shame. And they kept working. Because the wounded didn't care about reputation. They cared about relief, about kindness, about survival. And the nurses gave it, every day, every night, without fail. They earned respect not through titles, but through touch, through presence, through endurance. They became legends not because they were celebrated, but because they were undeniable. And though their reputations were questioned, their impact was not. They changed everything. By the winter of the Crimean campaign, it was no longer the sound of gunfire that haunted the nurses. It was the quiet, the long, heavy silences that followed the coughs, the rattling breaths, the whispered goodbyes. Death still came from musket balls and cannon blasts, but the deadlier enemy crept unseen through the wards, threading its way between the beds. Typhus, cholera, influenza. The nurses spoke their names in hushed tones, as though saying them too loudly might invite them closer. The soldiers had arrived expecting battle wounds, and nurses had arrived expecting to tend them. Neither group had truly understood the scale of the invisible war that waited for them. The fevers did not discriminate. Strong, young, newly arrived nurses fell just as quickly as those who had been there for months. They worked in crowded wards where beds were jammed so close together that it was impossible to move without brushing against another patient. The air hung thick with heat and breath, and each cough seemed to carry a hidden bullet. A nurse could spend the morning bathing a soldier's fevered brow, only to find herself shivering uncontrollably by evening. She might hope it was fatigue, but within hours the headache would bloom, her cheeks would flush, and the darkness would begin to settle in. Typhus announced itself slowly at first, a pounding behind the eyes, a bone-deep chill, then a rash creeping up the arms like ink spreading in water. By the time the skin changed, the fight was already lost. Cholera, on the other hand, came like a sudden storm. One moment the nurse might be standing over a patient, tying a fresh bandage, and the next she would be doubled over, her body convulsing with cramps, the color draining from her face. It stripped its victims bare in days, leaving nothing but shadows where a strong, laughing woman had stood. Influenza was the trickster of the three. It pretended to relent, coaxing hope from its victims, then returned with a vengeance that filled the lungs, drowned the breath, and exhausted what little strength was left. The nurses fought back in every way they could. They boiled water when they had fuel. They scrubbed their hands until the skin split. They burned the sheets of the dead when allowed, though even that could not keep pace with the spread. The hospital's supply of clean linen was never enough. Soap ran short. The water was often fouled. Every measure they took was a thin wall against a relentless tide. Florence Nightingale urged discipline and cleanliness, and her methods saved lives. But even she knew that discipline alone could not defeat the swarm of sickness that moved through their ranks. Replacements were promised from England, but they rarely came on time. Those who did arrive often brought more disease with them, having spent weeks in cramped ship quarters on the journey. The reality was brutal. When one nurse fell ill, another stepped in without pause, not because she was ready, but because there was no choice. The patients would not wait. The wounds still needed cleaning. The fevers still needed cooling. The dying still needed someone to sit beside them. Grief was a luxury that could not be afforded. Friendships formed quickly in such a place. The nurses became each other's family, their support in the long hours and their only relief in moments of rare laughter. But these bonds made the losses sharper. You could not tend a woman's patients, eat beside her, share the same cramped sleeping quarters for weeks, without learning the sound of her laugh or the stories she carried from home. And then, without warning, she would be gone. No ceremony marked her passing. Often, the only sign was her empty place at the table, or the way the ward felt quieter, as though the air itself understood what had been taken. There were no medals for nurses who died in Crimea, no public honors, no military burials. Many were laid in the same earth as the men they had tried to save. Their names were written in hospital records, sometimes no more than a single line, swallowed by the columns of statistics that Florence Nightingale so carefully kept. Those charts told a story few outside the hospitals ever heard. Far more nurses died from disease than from enemy fire. Yet for the women who remained, these deaths were not numbers. They were friends whose belongings they carefully packed into small bundles to be sent home. Friends whose last words echoed in their minds long after the body was gone. The sicknesses came in waves. There would be a brief lull when the wards felt lighter, when laughter cautiously returned. But then the fevers would rise again, and the losses would mount. After each wave, the nurses would take silent stock of who was left, wondering if the next would finish the rest. In the rare quiet moments, they would speak softly of home, the gardens they missed, the families they longed to see again. Sometimes they spoke of the dead as though they were still alive, just busy in another ward. It was easier than admitting the truth. At night, when the coughing quieted and the lamps burned low, the silence would press in on them. They knew there was no wall that could keep the sickness out, no cure that could be administered quickly enough, no prayer strong enough to stop it. The war outside might one day end, But inside the hospital, the invisible war would rage on. And as each day passed, they learned the cruelest truth of all. In Crimea, disease takes your friends first. There were mornings when the ward felt heavier than the night before. The smell of sickness lingered in the air. The cries of the wounded echoed in the halls, and the faces around the table were fewer than they had been the day before. In those moments, the weight of the Crimean winter seemed unbearable. But even in a place where death was constant and suffering seemed endless, there were moments that pierced through the darkness, small, fleeting bursts of grace that reminded the nurses why they stayed. They were not grand gestures. They were not the kind of victories that made their way into newspapers or history books. Most of the time, they went unnoticed by anyone except the person who received them. But for the nurses who moved through the endless corridors, tending to the sick and the dying, these small mercies meant everything. A single quiet "thank you" from a soldier could stay with them longer than a medal ever would. Sometimes it was a hand reaching out, not in desperation, but in gratitude. A soldier whose voice was too weak to speak might press the nurse's fingers gently, letting her know that her presence mattered, that he saw her, not just as another white figure moving through the ward, but as someone who had carried him through his worst hours. Those touches stayed with the nurses. They felt them in their palms long after the moment passed, a reminder that even in a place built on loss, human connection could still be found. Meals were rarely anything to celebrate. Bread that had gone hard, broth so thin it could be mistaken for water. But on the rare occasions when fresh food made its way to the hospital, it felt almost miraculous. A loaf still warm from the oven, a pot of stew that actually filled the stomach, a cup of tea that hadn't been brewed 3 times over. These were luxuries beyond measure. The nurses learned to savor them slowly, letting each bite or sip stretch out as long as possible, as though holding on to the taste could hold back the cold and the fatigue for a little while longer. The soldiers noticed, too. Some of them, even when weak and feverish, would save a crust of bread or a piece of fruit to offer to the nurse who had stayed by their side. They had little to give, but they gave what they could. And in accepting it, the nurses felt the unspoken bond that formed between them, a mutual recognition of shared struggle. Outside, the world continued to turn, and sometimes it offered its own gifts. The sunrises in Crimea were unlike any the nurses had known at home. The air would be bitter with frost, their breath rising in pale clouds, and yet the horizon would blaze with soft pinks and golds. In those moments, the war seemed to pause. The guns were quiet. The shouts from the camp faded. For a few precious minutes, the nurses could simply stand in the cold, watching the light spread across the hills, and remember that beauty still existed, even here. The sunsets were no less powerful. They often came after the most grueling days, when the wards had been filled beyond capacity, and every hand had been needed to keep chaos at bay. As the sky deepened into amber and violet, the tired women would lean against the doorway, breathing in the cool evening air. It didn't erase what they had seen or done that day, but it gave them a moment to gather themselves before returning to the work that never ended. Even laughter found a way to survive. It would come suddenly, often in the smallest of moments. A shared joke about the stubbornness of a patient, a fond teasing between 2 nurses, or a memory from home that made the whole table smile. These were not loud or boisterous laughs. They were soft, warm, almost cautious, as though afraid that too much joy might break the fragile spell. But they were real, and they mattered. One nurse kept a small sketchbook tucked in the pocket of her apron. On the rare evenings when she could sit without interruption, she would take it out and draw. Sometimes it was the faces of the men she tended, a way to remember them as more than their wounds. Sometimes it was the distant hills or the curve of the shoreline. She shared the pages with the others, and for a little while they would gather around, pointing out details, recalling stories that went with each drawing. It was a way of anchoring themselves in something other than illness and death. Letters from home were another kind of grace. The arrival of mail was like the breaking of a storm. Even the sickest patients seemed to find a little more strength when they saw familiar handwriting on an envelope. The nurses treasured their own letters, reading and rereading them until the paper grew soft and worn. For those without family, a kind word from a friend or even a stranger could light the darkness for days. And for those who could not read, the nurses would take the time to sit at the bedside and speak the words aloud, their voices carrying the warmth of faraway kitchens and safe hearths. There were also the moments that came not from kindness, but from a sense of triumph, small victories that reminded them the work was worth it. A soldier who had been given up for dead opening his eyes, a fever breaking in the middle of the night, a wound that healed cleanly instead of festering. These moments were fuel. They did not happen often, but when they did, the memory carried the nurses through the long, weary nights. Sometimes the grace came in the form of silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief, but the rare, gentle quiet when the ward seemed to breathe as one. The coughing would fade, the moans would ease, and for a brief spell, there was only the soft rustle of blankets and the steady rhythm of breathing. In those minutes, the nurses could rest their eyes, knowing that for once, no one was slipping away. Florence Nightingale understood the value of these moments. She encouraged her nurses to notice them, to hold on to them, because without them, the work would become unbearable. She herself could often be found walking the wards at night, her lamp casting a small circle of light. The soldiers called her the Lady with the Lamp, but to the nurses, she was a reminder that even leadership could be gentle. Sometimes she would pause at a bed and simply listen to the breathing of the man lying there, her presence a quiet form of comfort. The war raged on beyond the hospital walls, and the suffering within them never truly stopped. But these fragments of peace, a warm meal, a soldier's thanks, the blush of dawn on the horizon, became the threads that held the nurses together. They were reminders that they were still human, still capable of feeling something other than exhaustion and grief. Years later, when the nurses returned home and were asked about their time in Crimea, they spoke of the horrors, because those could not be forgotten. But they also spoke of these moments, of a soldier pressing a folded scrap of paper into their hand in gratitude, of bread still steaming in the cold morning air, of the way the sun rose over the Black Sea, turning the water to gold. These were the memories they carried like treasures, proof that even in the worst of times, grace could still be found. And in remembering them, they understood why they had stayed. When the guns finally fell silent in Crimea, there was no great cheer in the wards. News of peace moved slowly through the corridors, whispered at first, then spoken aloud with a mix of relief and disbelief. The nurses, who had worked day after day without promise of an end, paused only briefly to let the words sink in. They wanted to believe it was over, but habit had taught them not to trust hope too quickly. War had a way of stopping and starting without warning. And in the hospitals, the war did not end with the signing of any treaty. The beds were still full. The fevers still burned. The dying did not care for politics. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the wards did not change much. Bandages still needed changing. Wounds still needed cleaning. The smell of disinfectant and sickness still clung to the air. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. The constant fear of fresh waves of casualties eased. The terrible anticipation of the next battle's wounded slowly lifted, replaced by a quieter, more manageable dread. The knowledge that the work ahead was the work of mending, not scrambling to save men still bleeding from the field. Some of the nurses allowed themselves to imagine going home. They pictured the streets they had walked as girls, the kitchens where they had sat by warm fires, the familiar faces of family waiting at the door. Others could not imagine it at all. Home felt too far away, too different now. They had left as one person, and knew they would return as another. The war had changed them in ways that could not be undone. The journey back began slowly. Ships took the first groups of nurses away, their trunks lighter than when they had arrived, their uniforms worn thin from years of wear. The sea voyage home was a strange limbo, too far from the war to feel its urgency, too far from England to feel its safety. Many used the time to rest, though rest did not come easily. The silence of the ship's nights was different from the quiet of the wards. It was too deep, too absolute, and for some, it was unsettling. In the absence of groans and footsteps and clattering basins, the mind filled the void with memories. Some nurses carried visible wounds. The long months of hard work had bent their backs, strained their joints, and left them thin from constant labor and rationed meals. Others bore scars less easily seen. A hand that trembled when lifting a cup, eyes that flinched at sudden movement, a voice that fell into a whisper without meaning to. But the deepest injuries were the ones that had no mark at all. These were the faces that lived in memory. The men who had called for their mothers in their final moments, the friends who had slipped away in the night, the countless lives they had fought for but could not save. Homecoming was rarely what they had imagined. Families were glad to see them, but few truly understood what they had endured. Some relatives expected them to slip back into their old lives, as though they had been gone only a few weeks. Others avoided asking questions altogether, sensing there were answers they might not want to hear. For the nurses, the adjustment was uneasy. The quiet streets of their towns felt strange after the chaos of the hospital. The meals at home felt too rich, too easy, after years of scarcity. Even the softness of their beds was unfamiliar. More than one nurse found herself waking in the night, disoriented, half expecting to hear the call of an orderly or the rattle of a dying breath. In public, they were often celebrated, though the praise was uneven. Florence Nightingale's name had become famous, and through her, the idea of nursing had gained new respect. But the individual women who had worked beside her were not always remembered. Some were given small pensions or awards. Many returned to quiet lives, their service mentioned only in passing. It was as if the world wanted the comfort of a symbol without the discomfort of remembering the human cost. For some nurses, the only way to live with what they had seen was to keep working. They found positions in hospitals, workhouses, and infirmaries where the skills they had honed under fire could be put to use. They brought with them the lessons learned in Crimea, the importance of sanitation, the need for proper supplies, the dignity owed to every patient. In these roles, they became part of the slow, steady revolution in medical care that Nightingale had begun. But even in these new posts, they carried with them the habits of the war. They walked the wards at night with soft steps. They spoke in low voices. They worked until exhaustion was no longer a condition, but a state of being. Others could not bear to return to nursing at all. For them, the memories were too close, the smells too familiar, the sounds too sharp. They turned instead to lives far removed from the world of sickness and death, yet even there, the war lingered. A sudden cough could send their thoughts spiraling back to the wards. The sight of a man limping across the street could bring back the smell of iodine and the feel of damp bandages. And in the quiet moments, the faces of the men they had tended would come back, unbidden and unrelenting. The scars were not all born of grief. Some were formed from bonds too strong to fade. Many nurses kept in touch with soldiers they had cared for, exchanging letters that stretched over years. Some even met again, in happier circumstances, when a former patient sought out the nurse who had once sat by his bed through the long night. These reunions brought joy, but also a bittersweet reminder of those who had not survived to share such meetings. The world outside had moved on in their absence. Newspapers now wrote of other events, other crises. The Crimean War was already becoming history. Its realities softened in the telling. But for those who had lived it, The war was not a story to be polished or trimmed. It was the cold stone of a ward floor beneath their knees. It was the heavy weight of a fevered head in their hands. It was the moment the light went out in a man's eyes, and the silence that followed. As the years passed, some spoke of their time in Crimea with pride, others with pain. For many, the memories blurred, the sharp edges softened by distance. But certain images never faded. The feel of a soldier's hand gripping theirs in gratitude. The sound of boots in the corridor at night, bringing news they did not want to hear. The smell of the sea in the early morning, carrying both promise and sorrow. These memories lived alongside the nurses' daily lives, sometimes quiet, sometimes insistent, but always there. The war had ended, but the nurses carried it with them. It shaped the way they saw the world, the way they measured hardship, the way they valued moments of peace. They had witnessed the very worst of humanity and the very best, often in the same day. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. They had seen how compassion could survive even in the darkest places, and how the smallest kindness could change the course of a life. For the rest of their days, the nurses of the Crimean War were marked by what they had endured. Some wore their scars openly, speaking of them when asked. Others kept them hidden, choosing silence over explanation. But whether spoken or unspoken, those scars were real as the war itself, and as lasting as the memory of the friends they had lost. When they thought of Crimea, it was not the politics or the battles that came to mind. It was the faces. The men they had watched fight for each breath. The women they had worked beside, sharing whispered encouragement in the dead of night. The moments of grace that had kept them human in the midst of horror. And the knowledge that, though the war had ended, a part of it would always live within them.